Hello everyone, this game is going to be decisive for the final victory in the Lapline tournament. And this game is full of strategy and maneuvering. The player with the white pieces is the Ukrainian Grandmaster Yuri Solodovnichenko. He starts with the pawn to e4 and faces the French Grandmaster Joseph Guirel, who replies with the move to c5, known as the Sicilian Defense. White plays knight to c3, knight to c6, and then white plays knight to e2. It's more common to see white play knight to f3 to support the push to d4, but knight to e2 is also possible. You might say that this blocks the bishop on f1, but the idea is to push the pawn to d4, and in case of a capture, to recapture with the knight, so the diagonal for the bishop on f1 will be opened up. And if black plays e5 to prevent this push to d4, white can adopt another strategy, which is to place the knight from c3 to d5, freeing up the c3 square for the other knight, and then the bishop can develop, for example, to c4. In this position, black prefers to play knight to f6, and we get this push to d4. Pawn takes on d4, knight recaptures on d4 as planned, and now black plays e5, and this is a critical moment. A decision needs to be made with the knight on d4. Should it be exchanged for the knight on c6, move to b5, retreat to b3, go to e2, f3 or f5? 6 possible moves. But in reality, there is one move that is better than all the others. Which one? So if you want, you can pause the video now to take your time and think about which square you would choose for your knight. So what idea did you come up with? Here, the best move is to play knight to b5, and I'll try to explain why. There is this file that is semi-open in favor of white, meaning that white has no pawn there, they have pressure with their queen, and they even have firm control over the d5 square. So the d5 square is weak, the pawn on d7 is a backward pawn that will have trouble advancing, and so the strategy for black is to try to succeed in playing that d5. If the knight on c6 is exchanged, it will help black because the b7 pawn can recapture, and then this pawn on c6 can support the d5 push. So it's not advantageous for white to take the black knight. If the white knight comes to f5, it is targeted by the bishop on c8, so the d5 push will happen more easily because the bishop can capture the knight. If the knight now chooses to retreat to b3, e2 or f3, there could be the move bishop to b4, pinning the knight on c3, and also threatening to take the e4 pawn and to push d5, since the knight on c3 can no longer help control the d5 square. That's why the best decision here is to play knight to b5, threatening to jump into d6 with the knight, supported by the queen, and prompting black to play the pawn to d6. Once black plays the pawn to d6, the bishop will no longer be able to come to b4 to pin the knight on c3, and so the d6 pawn becomes a backward pawn that will have a hard time advancing to d5. And that's exactly what happens in the game. So black played d6 after this knight to b5 move. White plays bishop to g5. They pin the knight on f6, which is defending the d5 square, and are even preparing to eliminate this knight. Black plays a 6, attacking the white knight, which retreats to a 3. Black plays b5, threatening the fork on b4, but white immediately plays knight to d5. Black plays bishop to e7, and the knight is captured. Bishop takes f6, bishop recaptures, and this is an important decision because it changes the control of the colors. Let me explain. White now has one more piece to fight for control of the white squares, because the dark squared bishop obviously can't fight on the white square. Now, the d5 square is a centralized square on a white square. So white can establish themselves on this square. They don't fear the opponent's pair of bishops, because the opponent's dark squared bishop is clearly hindered by the d6 and e5 pawns, which block this diagonal. Of course, it's true, it can look for other diagonals, come to g5, but that diagonal is empty, or try to reposition itself to d8 and then later to b6, but in any case, it can be eliminated by the knight. Here, white has two ways to continue. The usual move is to play the pawn to c3. This allows the pawn to control the b4 and d4 squares, and to prevent any invasion by the black knight on c6. But it also frees up the c2 square for the a3 knight, which is poorly placed, so it can be repositioned to e3 or b4, and thus also help consolidate the knight's presence on d5. But here, the Ukrainian Grandmaster prefers to play the pawn to c4, with the idea that if black captures, the bishop can recapture and be well placed, or the knight can recapture, attack d6, sometimes threaten invasions on b6, or reposition itself to e3 to control the d5 square, also freeing up the c4 square for the bishop, for example. So after c4, it's not advantageous for black to capture, since that would help the knight and bishop get back into the game. So black plays the pawn to b4. The knight moves to c2, creating a double attack on the pawn on b4. Black plays a 5, and now white plays g3. Black plays g6. And here, it's another critical moment because the Ukrainian grandmaster decides to capture the dark squared bishop. That's not the move I was familiar with here. I was trained by Grandmaster Josef Dorfman, the former coach of world champion Kasparov. And Josef Dorfman explained to me that when you're playing with this kind of material balance, that is, two knights and a light squared bishop against the pair of bishops, and the knight taught me that you should try to break your opponent's bishop pair by exchanging the light squared bishops. That way, you would then have two knights playing against a knight and a bishop, with the bishop having a hard time being effective. So the move I knew here is actually the move h4. I even saw a game by Nakamura, the Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura, where he plays h4 with the idea of freeing up the h3 square for the bishop. For example, if black plays h5, which is what happened in his games, and bishop to h3 to exchange the light squared bishops, and then you have two knights against just one, allowing you to play on the light squares while always trying to restrict the dark squared bishop's diagonals. But here, as I mentioned, the Ukrainian grandmaster chose to take the dark squared bishop. The queen recaptures, he plays bishop to g2, bishop to b7, and the queen moves to d2. Here, the French grandmaster plays a surprising move. He retreats his knight to b8. Why this knight retreat when there are so many other things to do? There are several ideas behind this knight retreat. The knight is actually maneuvering. It's trying to come back to the c5 square to then increase pressure on the pawn at e4. And the idea is also to free up the diagonal for the light squared bishop so that the light squared bishop can control the d5 square. And so if the white knight heads for the d5 square, it will be eliminated by the light squared bishop. White plays rook to d1 to increase the pressure on the backward pawn at d6. Black plays rook to a6 to defend. It's true that moving the knight immediately allows the rook to also defend the pawn on d6. But now white infiltrates on h6, controlling the f8 square and preventing kingside castling. So to counter this incursion of the queen on h6, which controls the f8 square and prevents castling, the French grandmaster chooses to push the pawn to g5 to offer a queen exchange. But advancing the pawn to g5 weakens the f5 and h5 squares, and generally weakens the light squares. And we'll see that later in the endgame he will pay for these weaknesses. It will become problematic for him. But for now, he offers the queen exchange. White declines and moves to h5. Black continues to offer a queen exchange. This time it's very interesting for black if the queen takes, because the pawn will be able to recapture, controlling the f5 square and even opening the file for the rook. That's why white doesn't take the queen and retreats to f3. The knight settles on c5 as planned, putting triple pressure on the notable pawn. The knight also comes to settle on d5, but the bishop is going to eliminate the knight. Bishop takes d5, pawn takes d5. And we have this position where black has the favorable tandem of queen and knight against queen and light squared bishop. Why do I call it a favorable tandem? Because having a queen and knight is very collaborative. With this tandem, we have all the moves in the game. The problem for black is the advance of the pawn to g6, which has weakened the light squares. And that's going to give play to the light squared bishop, which normally shouldn't have any. And this f5 square and this h5 square, black is going to pay for the weakening of these two squares as a result of pushing the pawn to g5. Black is actually trying to hinder the play of the light squared bishop. They play h5, they want to play g4 precisely. h4 is played, g4, queen to e2. And here, you might wonder, but how is the light squared bishop going to be able to play well? White will eventually play f3 to attack g4, open up this diagonal, and regain control of the f5 square. Joseph Guérel here decides to play king to e7. He could have castled short, but he thinks his king will be more useful on e7. In reality, the king shelter isn't very good on e7, as we'll see a bit later. White castles short, and the rook comes to a 7. Black's idea now is to double the rooks on the file. In fact, white does the same. Rook to c1, rook to c8, rook to c4. The a rook comes to c7 and the f rook comes to c1. The king moves to d8, queen to e3. And this is where we realize that the king isn't so well placed, because as soon as the knight moves, if there's a rook exchange, the white queen will be able to come in once all 4 rooks are traded and attack the king. So in the end, the king isn't well sheltered in this position, and that prevents black from exchanging the rooks. Because the ideal for black would be to manage to exchange the rooks and play with the queen and knight tandem against the queen and light squared bishop. Black plays king to e7, king to h2, king to d8. We can see that black doesn't really know how to proceed, and white plays f3. Their idea now is to open up this diagonal on the light squares. Moreover, if the bishop comes to h3, the rook on c8 won't be able to stay on the file, and it will be white who can use the c file if the knight happens to move. But for now, of course, the knight is going to stay there. Capture on f3. The queen takes on f3 to allow for this move bishop to h3, king to e7. The bishop comes to h3, attacking the rook, which moves to g8. Of course, white has managed to open the f file and the diagonal, but they give up the g file with this attack on g3. Queen to e3 is played, the king moves to d8, and the bishop settles on f5. As I mentioned earlier, the absence of the g6 pawn gives the bishop access to the f5 square. The bishop will actively defend the d4 pawn this way, pushing back the queen and controlling this important diagonal. The queen gracefully moves to f6, the rook advances to c2, the king proceeds to e7, the rook then moves to f2, the queen glides to g7, the rook shifts to f3, and finally, the rook reaches h8. And here comes an important maneuver. How would you play as white? I'm not just asking for a single move, but for a plan. How would you try to make progress as white in this position? Because after all, black has the knight on c5, which completely blocks any chances of breaking through on the queen side, and the black position seems well defended, very solid. How could one make progress in this position? You can pause the video if you want to take your time to think about it. How do we proceed? The idea is to always attack the weaknesses on the white squares. What weaknesses are there on the white squares? The pawn on f7 and the pawn on h5. White will organize to attack both. They will play bishop to h3, and we'll see that the bishop will reposition itself on this diagonal to attack h5, while the heavy pieces, the rook and queen, attack the pawn on f7. The black queen moves to h6. White declines the queen exchange. They attack the pawn on f7, queen to g6. The rook comes to f5, so it's the rook that takes the bishop's place to attack the pawn on h5 laterally and the pawn on f7 vertically. Black plays f6. Black removes the weakness of the pawn on f7. On the other hand, since black puts all their pawns on dark squares, they weaken the light diagonals, which will allow the light squared bishop to find opportunities for incursions later in the game. The queen moves to e2 to attack the pawn on h5, king to d8. She returns to f3. The idea is to free up the e2 square so the bishop can come to f1 and then to e2. It's true that the queen could have gone directly to f3. King to e7, the bishop comes to f1, rook to c8. The bishop moves to e2, and now the h5 pawn can no longer be saved. White will capture the h5 pawn and get a passed pawn on the h file. Rook to h7, rook takes h5, rook takes h5, queen takes h5. A queen exchange is offered, which black accepts. Rook to b8 is played. Why rook to b8? Black is going to try to play b3 to open the b file and look for some counterplay. But you might say, if black plays b3, white can always respond with a3 and prevent the file from opening. But then there would be knight to d3 attacking the b2 pawn, and we see that the rook can't come to defend. It can't come to c2 because of the pawn. So faced with this threat of pushing b3, white will play their own pawn to b3. The black rook moves to b7. The bishop moves to d1, so why is it not easy to make progress? It's true that we can advance the pawn to g4, the pawn to h5, but after that we'll be blocked on the dark squares, especially if the black king comes to g7, h6, or g5. Since we have a light squared bishop, the black king will try to block and hinder the progress of our pawn majority by controlling the dark squares. And the light squared bishop won't be able to help us, so we need the help of the rook. But as soon as the rook leaves the c-file and stops putting pressure on the pawn on b4, for example, if at some point the rook moves to c2 to try to get to the fg or h-file, risk is that we let black play to attack the b3 pawn and try to find some counterplay. That's why the bishop comes to d1. It comes here to protect the b3 pawn and to control the a4 square, preventing black from finding counterplay. But now, it's going to be difficult to find the right balance between advancing the passed h pawn and the king's progress and defending against the counterplay that black might have on the queen side. Black plays rook to c7. The king moves to h3, rook to c8. The bishop moves to g4. This attacks the rook, which returns to a dark square. The bishop moves to f5, king to f8. The pawn advances to g4, king to g7. Rook to c2, rook to a7, rook to c4 to attack the b4 pawn and prevent black from playing a4 themselves. King to h6, king to g2. So if we play the pawn to h5, the king will simply come to g5. Here, the king goes back to h7. It's the same if we play h5, the king will eventually get in. So, as we'll see in the game, white will eventually play g5. King to f1, rook to c7, king to o2. We wonder why the king is coming back. But the original idea, I think, for white was to use the rook to support the advance. But he realized that if the rook left the queen side, black could find counterplay on the queen side, so the white king tries to come back. He tries to come back to defend infiltration squares. g5 is played, pawn takes, king to g8, g6 is played, king to g7. And for example here, the rook could come to c1 and then move over to the h file, for instance, to try to get to h7, because the black rook would have a harder time infiltrating. It wouldn't have the c2 square, for example, since the king controls the c2 square. But here, the Ukrainian grandmaster chooses to play king to c2, king to f6, he puts his king on b1, king to g7, he plays the rook to c1, king to f6, and he realizes that he can't leave the queen side. The rook can go to h1, because if the rook goes to h1, the knight comes to d3, and the rook won't be able to go up to h7 because of rook to c1, checkmate. The knight will protect and control the b2 square. So in this position, the king isn't well placed on b1, nor on b2 for that matter, because there would be knight to d3, so there's no way to use the rook to try to make progress on the king side while leaving the king on the queen side. It's just not possible. So the rook goes back to c4, king to g7, and the Ukrainian grandmaster realizes that the king has to go back to the other side. King to d2, king to g7, king to e3, king to f6, king to f3, king to g7, king to g4, king to f6. Now he plays rook to c2, rook to a7. He moves to h2. Black counterattacks with a4, which they couldn't do, as long as the white rook was on c4. But now that the white rook moves to the king side to try to support the advance, black counterattacks on the queen side with this pressure from the pawn on b3 and the pawn on a2 looming in the background. White captures on a4. The knight recaptures and will try to come to c3, attacking the a2 pawn to create a passed pawn on b4. And here, white cannot play rook to h7. That's not possible, because if white plays rook to h7, black simply exchanges. Rook takes, pawn takes. They come to g7 to block the pawn's promotion, and the knight on a4 can come to c3 to simply eliminate the a2 pawn, and it's actually black who has winning chances with their own b pawn. So in this position, the rook comes to h6. That's clever, because it threatens g7 with check. And you might say, on g7, the king will take, but in that case, rook to h7 will allow you to win the rook. So the move rook to h6 threatens the pawn push to g7. And if the king comes to g7, of course you play rook to h7 immediately. So the black rook comes to g7. Here, it's the same. You can play rook to h7 because of the rook exchange, king to g7, and then the knight will come to c3 to eliminate the pawn on a2. So the rook comes to h8. It has managed to infiltrate black's camp, to take the 8th rank, and to maneuver around the board. The knight comes to c3 to attack the pawn on a2. The rook can come to defend immediately, but first rook to f8 check, to force the king to retreat, and give the white king a chance to infiltrate. The king moves to e7, rook to a8, comes to defend the pawn on a2, and prepares counterattacks on the 7th rank, but also, as we will see, on the 6th rank, ultimately by this maneuver of circling Aron rook to c4, rook to c1, rook to h1, rook to h8, rook to a8, the white side controls the last 3 ranks of the black side, with possible checks on these last 3 ranks. The king comes to f6, rook to a6 to attack the d6 pawn, and black cannot defend naturally since the rook cannot come to d7 because of bishop takes. And after king to e7, that allows the white king to infiltrate via g5. And then we can give checks. We can also try to infiltrate with white king. It will be much easier to win. In this position, black chose to play rook to b7, but then there's rook takes d6 with check, the king moves to g7, the rook comes back to defend the pawn on a6, and in the end, the French grandmaster Joseph Guirel ends up resigning. He realizes now that he won't be able to hold this position. He's down 2 pawns, but above all, white has an active position. Now the white king has access to this square on g5. The black rook can't move from the 7th rank, otherwise rook to a7 would be very dangerous for black. There's this pawn on d5, which is a passed pawn that can be pushed forward. We can play d6 and then d7, since the bishop controls the d7 square, and then threaten to promote. So obviously, for an amateur player, winning here is still not easy, but for a player of the Ukrainian Grandmaster strengths, it's quite straightforward. That's why the French Grandmaster decides to resign here.